Chapter 24, Bright Sunshine. I woke up the next morning when the sun shone in through the window and warmed the heavy blankets I had buried myself under. I blinked my eyes and wondered for a moment why I felt so wonderful. The instant I remember seeing Annetta last night, I also remembered snowmobiling today. I found my watch on the floor and jumped out of bed instantly when I saw I only had half an hour. After a quick shower, I found Grandma downstairs with a breakfast of toast and eggs waiting. "Good morning, Grandma," I said, giving her a hug. "Feels like I haven't seen you in ages. How was shopping?" "We had a nice time, thank you," Grandma answered. "Where were you all night?" "I skied into town, then Netta gave me a ride home." Grandma's eyes raised a little as a smile spread over her face. I knew she was happy for me. "Does that mean you're joining everyone to go snowmobiling today?" she asked. "Yeah," I answered. "I'm almost late, as a matter of fact." "Oh, I wouldn't worry too much," she said. "They never leave quite when they say they will. And I made you lunch." "You're the best, Grandma," I said as I shoveled the eggs and toast into my mouth, trying to eat as quickly as possible. "Will you be taking Grandpa's sled?" she asked. "Could I? That would be great." "Of course you may," Grandma answered. "It's out in the back of the truck, but I don't know if you'll be able to start that old thing. It started the other day. It runs great." "Then you'll have the fastest snowmobile on the mountain," Grandma said, smiling at my excitement. It was true. Grandpa's truck was plenty old. "They don't make 'em like they used to," he always said. "Yep, they make 'em better," someone would invariably answer. But he kept it running and in good shape. Grandpa's snowmobile was an entirely different matter. He never pretended that old boxy sleds were any match for modern technology, and he always chose the best machine money could buy. I ran upstairs to brush my teeth, then grabbed my waterproof winter clothes, found a helmet in the closet, and ran out the back door after kissing Grandma goodbye. "We'll talk soon," I promised. "You go have yourself a good time," she answered, "and be safe." I tossed everything but the sack lunch in the front seat, then walked to the back of the truck. The snowmobile was beautiful, and I couldn't help stopping to admire it for a moment. I remembered the power of its 900cc engine, the grip of its 160-inch track with 3-inch lugs, and couldn't wait to pull it out of the truck, squeeze the throttle, and feel it fly across the snowfields again. I put the lunch inside a saddlebag attached to the rear of the snowmobile seat. Inside the bag, I also found a thermal foil-coated tarp, half a dozen year-old chemical hand warmers that probably wouldn't work anymore, and a few granola bars equally old. I grimaced and tossed the granola bars onto the woodpile. I found a half-full gas can that I set in the truck bed, then jumped into the cab and started the engine. It was already 10 past 8, and I hoped I wouldn't miss the group, since I didn't know exactly where we'd be riding. Of course, I could always call Andrea to find out. I flew over the road to town and noticed to my dismay that the wind had drifted away most of the new snow and exposed the old hard crust. "Oh well," I thought, "there will be more powder in the mountains." I reached the parking lot next to the highway just as everyone began piling into various trucks with a dozen sleds piled on trailers or resting in truck beds. I stopped the truck and stepped out, hoping to locate Netta somewhere in the crowd. Jim turned around and I saw a smile on his face. It transformed him, and I realized that I probably had misjudged him from our brief encounters at the cafe. As our eyes met, his smile faded and he gave me a curt nod before turning away. A few trucks were pulling off the road, and I had resigned myself to driving up alone when Amy jumped out of a Suburban and ran over. She opened the passenger door and climbed in. "Hey, you ready?" she asked. "Let's get going." I climbed into the cab and said hi. "Netta's got to ride up with Dad," Amy said. "She's getting grilled about you right now." She made a tisk, tisk, tisk sound with her tongue. "You should have gone and met him." I shrugged my shoulders. "Yeah, I guess so. Don't worry about it, though. It's no biggie." Amy spun around and looked the snowmobile over. "Nice machine you got there. We are going to have fun." By now, everyone had begun moving, and we pulled out behind Jim's truck onto the highway. "It's too bad about the whole Netta thing," Amy said. I looked over questioningly, and she added, "I mean the whole Jim thing. He's a great guy. I'm sure you'd have gotten along great if not for, the whole Netta thing." "Yeah, too bad," I agreed, more wholeheartedly than Amy could have known. "If not for the whole Jim thing, Netta and I would have had one less barrier between us." "So, Spence, you much of a snow rider?" "I've been out a dozen times," I answered. "We usually ride down in the other end of the valley when we come up for Christmas." You're going to love the canyons then, Amy said. It's 1,000,000 times better than the valley. There are tons of areas to choose from with steep hills and drifts and everything. You'll see. Sounds great. I'm glad I came. Amy picked up my gloves, gaiters, and pant shells from the floor and set them on the seat behind her. Nice gear, she said. You sure you're not a serious rider? Yeah, I mostly use that for cross-country skiing and backcountry stuff. Really? Ever been on any serious treks? Not really, I answered. I mostly go out for a few hours at a time. I usually camp once or twice each winter, though. In snow caves? Sometimes. Usually we just bring a tent unless we know somewhere where other people have already dug caves. They take a long time. It seems like snow caves would be cold, Amy said. They're actually pretty warm inside. The air stays above freezing if you build it right. I once got caught in a blizzard about 15 miles from my car. I didn't have a tent, so I decided to dig a snow cave under a drift with the back of my ski. By the time I had it big enough to crawl into, it was probably 3 a.m., and I was soaked. Once I stopped digging, I got cold and ended up just skiing through the storm back to the car anyway. Sounds like fun, Amy said enthusiastically. Sounds beautiful. It's kind of funny now, I admitted, but I felt miserable then. I got pretty cold. Well, it's a beautiful, sunshiny day today, Amy said, and reached up to turn on the radio. The truck only had an AM radio, and Amy turned it up loud enough for the music to begin to distort. We found enough songs that we knew to sing along with for most of the drive. Sometimes I would glance over at this bundle of energy and enthusiasm sitting beside me. Her presence felt like rays of warm, bright sunshine, powerful enough to cheer up even the most determined pessimist. I was surprised to realize that I automatically loved this girl much the same way I had naturally fallen for her older sister. When we reached the snow-covered parking lot in the mountains, we backed up to the snow pile where a plow had pushed it. Jim walked over and helped me pull the sled out without a word. You sure you can handle this machine? He asked. I'll do my best, I affirmed. I filled the gas tank and opened the fuel line, opened the choke, and pressed the starter button. The engine turned over a few times slowly, then stopped. The battery was drained, so I'd have to use the starting cord. I gave it several pulls with no results. Most of the other sleds had been unloaded, and a few of them were already sputtering and roaring as their riders drove them out of the way. I gave the cord another pull and heard Jim yell from across the parking lot, You sure you can handle that machine? I looked up and waved a bit, feeling a bit timid and hoping it would start soon. He laughed and started up his own machine. Netta finished putting on her bibs and boots and headed my way. I pulled harder, hoping this time it would go. I heard it almost fire, I thought. Jim rode his machine over to me, half standing, half kneeling on his sled. He got off, walked over to my machine, and lifted up on the kill switch, which I had forgotten to check. He gave a quick pull on the cord, and the engine instantly roared to life. There you go, he said, smiling. Oh yeah, I said sheepishly. Thanks. He nodded at Netta, still walking our way, and drove off. Netta walked up close to me, but didn't give me a hug. You'd better get dressed quick, she said. Why's that? I asked. Because if you don't, you're going to lose our race, she smiled. Good to see you. Good to see you too, I answered. I'd love to talk, but I have to get dressed for a race. When I had pulled on my gear, I turned to find Netta sitting on Grandpa's sled waiting. Are you driving mine for the race? I asked. That's right, she answered. The race was for the driver's seat. Climb on. I sat down on the seat behind Netta and wrapped one arm around her waist, gripping the seat strap with the other hand, and Netta hit the throttle. The sled jolted forward while spitting a rooster tail of ice and packed powder out behind us. The powerful engine roared as we accelerated, rocketing ahead toward the powder-covered hills. We were instantly away from the parking lot and began passing other sleds, which moved at a more conservative pace. Now I was grateful for the sled's extra long track and deep tread as we glided easily over the soft surface. Other sleds struggled to maintain speed and avoid bogging down in the deep powder. It wasn't long before we had passed everyone. A cold wind blew in through my open visor, and the trees and ridges blurred as my eyes watered. The combination of cold, speed, and beauty made me feel more awake and alert than I had in months. The snowmobile rose and fell over the uneven contours of the narrow valley below us, and I let go of the strap and wrapped both arms around Netta's waist. I felt awake and happy. Annetta maneuvered smoothly between loosely spaced pines, and I leaned hard left with her as we took a sharp turn up to the top of a low ridge. Along the crest, a narrow path opened between the trees, sometimes barely wide enough for our sled to pass through without whipping us in the face with the needles, weighted down with new snow. I looked forward down the ridge, and I saw that it opened up into a wide clearing about 50 yards away. The distance was passing quickly, and the nearer we grew, the more it appeared that the trail ended with a cliff. I felt confident that Netta would see it and didn't say anything, but held a little tighter anyway, getting ready for another abrupt turn. By the time I realized she wasn't turning, it was too late to do anything about it. She had veered slightly to one side, but we still shot over the edge into utterly empty air. Gravity vanished. Only Netta's firm grip on the handlebars and my hold around her waist kept us from floating away into space. The roar of the engine lessened momentarily as we plummeted through the air with the soft whistle of wind blowing through open helmet visors. The world and sound returned as we made a smooth, steep landing in soft powder. Our helmets knocked together, and Netta opened the throttle all the way up again. We must have dropped only 5 or 10 feet, but that had given me enough time to wonder whether or not I should jump clear. We scooted across the half-mile-wide clearing, and my adrenaline was still pumping as she brought us to a stop in the center and killed the engine. "Having fun?" Netta asked, pulling off her helmet and spinning sideways on the seat to look in my eyes. "Sure am," I answered, "but I'm going to have to dock you for that improper left turn, failure to signal, and this has got to be the sloppiest parallel parking job I've ever seen." "You mean I don't get my license?" she asked with a shocked expression. "I'm sorry, Missy. It's going to be a while before we can turn you loose on the streets. It wouldn't be safe." I pulled off my own helmet and added, "I assume you knew about the cliff?" "Yeah," she added. "I've only gone off it a couple times, but I couldn't resist. Did I scare you?" "What, that little thing?" "I hardly noticed." "Scared me too," Annetta admitted. She leaned back against me and sighed. "Beautiful, no?" It was. The meadow stretched away 150 yards in every direction across perfectly flat ground, sloping up slightly around the edges and becoming steep mountainsides or tree-covered ridges with narrow canyons leading up and out in every direction. "There's a shallow lake underneath us," Netta told me. "It's frozen solid right now." In the distance, the high-pitched whine of snow machines grew nearer. The first sleds appeared behind us, apparently having followed our track, but most of them slowed and skirted around the edge of the cliff as they emerged from the trees. 1 or 2 took timid leaps from the cliff edge where they dropped 3 or 4 feet. "This place will be full of snowmobiles in a minute," Annetta said. "Let's go." She stood up and stepped around behind me. I slid forward and started the engine. "Ready?" I asked after we put our helmets back on. Annetta held on tight. "Let's go," she said. The smooth powder felt even better from the driver's seat. I made a large loop around the clearing first to enjoy the glassy feeling of powder, then randomly chose one of the half-dozen canyons, and the clearing disappeared behind us. Annetta's arms stayed tight around my waist and chest as we flew through snow-covered pines and up and down the narrow canyon walls. The canyon floor widened at one point, and I saw a small drift running along the top ridge, about 50 feet up. I drove up the opposite canyon wall, then made a slow curve to conserve our speed and charged the opposite mountain. When we reached the top, we still had just enough speed to send us crashing through the soft curl of new snow. Even ducking behind the short windshield didn't protect us from the pile of snow that tumbled over our heads. A few flakes made their way inside my coat collar and melted against my neck. Netta loved it. "Do it again," she said between laughs. We continued over the ridge and stopped before diving into the next canyon. Atop the far side sat a 6-foot cornice, not all of which had been formed by last night's storm. The older snow wouldn't be as soft. "What do you think?" I asked. "I don't think we'd make it through that one," she replied. I lowered my visor like a knight ready for a round of jousting, and without so much as asking if she was ready, I hit the gas and charged down into the canyon. I kept the throttle squeezed tight all the way across the canyon floor and headed straight up the other side. "Spencer, don't do it!" Netta screamed. "Spencer!" 20 feet before the cornice, I steered us gently to the left, turning us around slowly and avoiding the drift. We probably could have reached out and touched the overhanging snow as it passed by to our right, and then we came barreling back downward. "How did you like that?" I asked when we came to a stop. Netta reached up and opened my visor without a word. The next thing I knew, I had a face full of snow as she packed it into my helmet with her other hand. I pulled off my helmet as she continued to throw snow in my face, then grabbed her and pushed her off the back of the sled. She held her own well for not being able to see once I had packed a few handfuls of snow into her helmet. We were both on the ground wrestling in the snow when another sled pulled up next to us. We hadn't heard it coming over the sputter of our own idling engine. "You two stuck?" the driver asked. "No, we're fine," I answered, water dripping down my face. "I just got something in my eye and had to stop." Annetta sat up and pulled off her helmet, clearing the snow out of her eyes. "Hi, Dad," she said. "This is Spencer." Mr. Hall looked me over for a second. I began feeling more than a little uncomfortable. This probably wasn't the way most fathers would prefer to meet their daughters' dates, rolling around on the ground like that. "I've heard a lot about you," he said finally, extending his hand. "I've heard a little about you too," I answered, shaking it and wishing I'd heard a little more. "You'd better watch out," he said, then looked over at his daughter. This does not sound good, I thought. I looked over at Netta, her grinning face still dripping wet, and Mr. Hall continued, "Or this little girl will catch you off guard." "So I've learned," I answered, and breathed a sigh of relief that I wasn't in trouble. "That's right," Netta shouted, jumping up with an armful of snow meant for her father's face. Mr. Hall caught her before she could get solid footing for her attack and held her tight, her arms pinned between them. "Truce?" he asked. Annetta thought it over, still grinning. She looked like a little girl there, playing so easily with her father. With me, she had always seemed so independent and grown up. Now I saw the childish, playful side of her emerge. Mr. Hall began to smile too, apparently making his own plans for the snow battle. "Truce! Truce!" Annetta suddenly cried, suing for peace. But it was too late. Mr. Hall's 6-foot-plus frame easily picked Annetta up and set her down in the snow. He barely managed to hold her in place there while his other hand scooped snow onto her face. "Spencer, help!" she shouted, giggling and laughing almost too hard to speak. I knelt down in the snow beside them and scooped enough snow over to cover her face completely. She stopped struggling then, and Mr. Hall let her go. She just lay there for a moment, then sat up, the snow piling into her lap. "What I meant," she clarified, "was to help me." "Oh, I'm sorry for the misunderstanding," I apologized. We all stood up and brushed ourselves off, then sat side saddle on our parallel sleds. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" Mr. Hall asked. "Sure is," I agreed, "and these mountains are spectacular." "That's correct," said Mr. Hall, as if their beauty were scientific rather than artistic. "Do you know how mountains are formed?" I suddenly felt like a student in class. Perhaps his appreciation really was academic. "When plates of the Earth's crust clash?" I ventured. "Correct. In most cases, one tectonic plate is forced down while the other rises over it. The range around Amber is unusual in that as the plates came together, both plates were forced upward above the plane. Don't you think that's fascinating?" "Yeah, that's interesting," I said, and looked around to compare the nearby ridges to other mountains I had known, but couldn't tell the difference. When I looked back at Mr. Hall, our eyes met, and I was instantly struck by the impression that I knew him, really knew him, much like my experience with Annetta the other night, but even stronger. He seemed comfortable and confident, his mind open and inquisitive. Intelligence and acceptance seemed to radiate from him. I sensed his sincere interest in the world and in people, his genuine perspective that life is fun and joyful. I felt sure that whenever he met someone new, that he turned it into a win-win situation, and both people were uplifted. So that's where the girls get it, I thought, and I wondered what their mother was like. I would ask later on, I decided, and I could hardly wait to meet her. "I'm sure we'll see each other a lot more now that we've been introduced," he stated. I couldn't tell whether that sounded more like an invitation or a command. "I'm sure we will," I agreed. "That sounds good. Do you want to ride with us?" I offered. "Sure, for a minute, till whenever we get separated," he answered, "or until you can't keep up. But I'll see you back at the clearing for lunch. Meet at 2 o'clock. Mr. Hall straddled his snowmobile again and took off up the canyon. Netta and I picked up our helmets to empty the snow from them and sat down next to each other along the snowmobile seat. "Your dad seems like a pretty cool guy," I said. "I knew you'd like him," Annette answered. "I knew he'd like you, too." "What made you so sure?" "Because he looks right into the center of you, and he sees what's in there. And if you have a good heart, then—" Annetta's voice trailed off here. She seemed to be thinking of something else as she finished the sentence. "He loves you." "That's amazing," I said. In her expression, I caught a glimpse of the clouded look she always got just before telling me that we shouldn't get involved. "Are you driving now or me?" I asked, anxious to move her attention away from that thought before it led anywhere. Netta looked up at me without answering, the troubled expression still spreading across her face. This was not a discussion I would win with words, I knew. Instead, I stood up and stepped over the snowmobile seat, then sat down facing the opposite direction. I reached out and pulled her tight against me. She hugged me back weakly for a moment, then a little stronger. "Thanks," she said, letting go and pulling her helmet. Chapter 25. The Greatest Fear. Annetta and I rode back to the parking lot and picked up her snowmobile. As much as I liked having her arms wrapped around me, driving was a lot easier and more fun with only one person per sled. We got stuck a few times when the track dug deep into the snow, and digging out proved an exhausting exercise, but it gave us a chance to sit and talk for a few minutes while we rested up and cooled off. As we joked and laughed and talked and told stories, I was amazed to realize that my old self-consciousness, my old panic that I would run out of things to say, or worse, say something stupid and make a fool of myself, seemed completely gone. At least for now, at least with Annetta. "I've wasted too much of my life," I confided. "What do you mean?" Annetta inquired. "I used to be so shy and afraid," I explained, omitting the fact that I was referring to everything before last week. "I missed out on so much because I never even tried, but if I had tried, I'm sure I would have failed anyway because I was so afraid of failing." Annetta simply replied, looking and trying to imagine a shy, scared version of me. I wanted to tell her the rest. I wanted her to know how much she had changed me, but I didn't dare. The old me had not completely vanished, and I was afraid that if she knew that part of me, that she would lose any interest in me, and I would lose any chance of wearing down her walls and possibly, maybe, hopefully establishing a long-term relationship. No, I would keep up the confidence act until it became real, until it became complete, until, hopefully, Annetta fell for me completely and we lived happily ever after. "Come over here," I said, patting the seat next to me with my hand. "I want to," Annetta admitted, "but I don't want to." "Explain," I requested. "You already know, Spencer," she said. "You know I like you more than I want to, and you know I can't get as close to you as I'd like to, or it will make it harder to leave next month. And you know," I countered, "that I don't care about that. I want to live courageously and not miss out on any more living, especially when I find something as good as you." "So you're not going to cooperate?" she asked, looking mildly annoyed. "I'm afraid not," I said apologetically. "All right," she began after a brief pause. "I'll answer your question from the other night. I'll tell you what I'm most afraid of." She stomped a more comfortable shelf in the snow for her feet and leaned against her stuck snowmobile seat, settling in for what could take a while. "Have you ever broken your heart?" she asked. "No," I answered. "Well, I have, several times, and it's not fun." I nodded, considering the information respectfully, but not yet feeling swayed. "Afterward, it's like being buried underground where you can barely breathe and hardly move." I had to admit, that didn't sound fun. "The last time," she continued, "it took so long to dig my way back up to the surface that I finally learned my lesson." "What lesson was that?" I asked, though I already had a pretty good idea. "To not risk it again," she answered decisively. When she saw the perplexed look appearing on my face, the one that asked if she really intended to live the rest of her life without love, she added, "I mean, to manage the risks very carefully, to move forward very slowly and not get involved that way when, for example, I know I can only be with someone for a few weeks." I simply replied. I had to admit it sounded reasonable. I wished I had some sort of powerful argument why she should open up to me anyway, but I didn't. In fact, I was afraid that she had convinced me that I should respect her boundaries. "Then again," she said slowly, thoughtfully, staring at me intently. I waited for her to continue, but not eagerly, barely interested in what she might say next. What more could she say that would matter? The question seemed settled, and she had won, and I had lost. I never planned, she began again slowly, to meet anyone quite like you. What? Did I hear right? I didn't plan to tell you that part, she revealed immediately, appearing annoyed at herself for letting it slip out. But now I knew the truth. Annetta liked me. She really liked me. She maybe even loved me, just a little, or at least had begun to. Part of her wanted to break down those old walls, break her rule, and take a chance. Otherwise, she never would have let that last part slip out. And if that was true, then maybe she wanted me to... I stood up and walked over to her sled, then sat down next to her and put an arm around her shoulders. I wanted her to turn toward me and return my embrace. I wanted to feel her warm cheek against mine, her hot breath against my neck. She buried her face in her gloves for a moment and shook her head. Spencer, no, she finally said, her resolve winning over her doubts. No, she repeated more firmly, looking into my eyes this time, then away toward the horizon. Don't, she added when I didn't remove my arm from her shoulder. I've made up my mind. It's the smart thing to do. I'll be glad later. I'm sorry, but I have to watch out for myself first. Let's go, she continued quickly. Let's ride some more. She stepped over her seat and hit the starter button, burying any chance of further conversation in the roar of her engine. Chapter 26. Passion. The day grew warm and cloudless bluebird skies created an irresistible cheerfulness that eased my disappointment at Annetta's decision not to get closer. After another hour of riding through the beautiful mountains, I was even getting used to the idea of just staying close friends and nothing more. I could hardly complain, after all. I would spend another week or two, perhaps several hours per day, with a beautiful, interesting girl who really liked me, and that had already transformed me in miraculous ways. Who could say how much more I would improve by the time I went back to school and she flew away around the world? By the time we headed back to the central clearing for lunch, I felt extremely lucky and grateful for our mostly platonic relationship. We raced across the wide-open expanse and pulled up next to Mr. Hall and Amy. They both sat on their sled seats backwards, using the rest of the seat as a table, and we caught the end of their conversation. I don't know, Dad, Amy said. It was fun, but it doesn't seem like the thing for me. Do you think you'll do another one? Mr. Hall asked. Amy thought for a moment. Yeah, maybe. I don't know. We'll see. Talking about the play? Annetta asked. Yeah, Amy answered. Dad's trying to figure out my life again. Do you think I should become an actress? Do you want to? Annetta asked. How come I knew you'd say that? Amy complained. Yes, no, maybe. How am I supposed to know after one play? You're not. If you like it enough to do another one, then do another and decide later. Yeah, but what if I do another one, Amy explained, and I like it, then how do I know that there's not something else I'd like even better? Try a little of everything. Figure it out a little at a time, Annetta said. Yeah, that did you a lot of good, big sister. You got a degree in liberal arts, and you still don't know what you want to do. I want to do everything, Annetta retorted. That's different. Yeah, that sounds even more confusing. Well, there's no hurry, Annetta pointed out. I have time. Why don't you go back to school and get a master's degree in liberal arts? Amy asked. There's no such thing, Annetta answered. I wonder why, Amy added sarcastically. What do you think, Spencer? Am I cut out to be an actress? I finished chewing my bite of sandwich and swallowed. Absolutely. If you don't become an actress, the theatrical world will never be the same. Amy smiled happily at that. Yeah, but what about all the other worlds? Are you sure I should be an actress? I'm positive, I affirmed. I've never been so sure of anything in my life. Amy frowned once she recognized my exaggeration. Okay, she conceded. I get the point. I just thought the answers would be easier to find. If you always do what you want to be doing, Annetta said, then you'll always be doing what you want to be doing. What about you, Spencer? Mr. Hall asked. What are your plans? Yeah, Amy said. You have a real major. You must have it all figured out. You're an English major, aren't you? Mr. Hall asked. Are you planning to teach? That might be okay, I answered. I don't really know what I'll do either, but I think I'd like to write. Really? What kinds of things would you write? I don't have all that figured out yet, I answered. Something fun to read, hopefully, and something that could make a difference for the world. Anyway, writing's so competitive and risky, so I guess I'll have to find something else to do officially. Well, whatever you decide, Mr. Hall said, make sure to use your talents and passions. They were given to you for a reason, and that's where you'll find the true payoffs. Yeah, unless your talents and passions have to be teaching, Amy said. That doesn't pay much, does it, Daddy? Mr. Hall looked at her and smiled wryly. True, he admitted. But can you imagine what the world would be like if the schools were filled with talented teachers who were passionate about teaching and about their students? I reflected for a moment on what my talents and passions might be. I loved the outdoors, for one, but couldn't think of how that might translate into a career. I liked to write, to analyze and examine, to learn, and then share what I learned. That sounded a lot like teaching. I liked my friends. I liked growing happier and more courageous. I liked pumpkin pie and hot chocolate. The more I thought about it, the less my interests seemed like a useful compass to choose a career. So how do you recognize your talents and passions? I asked. Mr. Hall's eyes lit up at the chance to explain what was clearly a favorite topic, though it seemed altogether possible that he had dozens of them. That's easy, he began. Just look back and observe what you enjoy doing and what you seem to have a knack for, or what you always seem to do well. Also, look for what gets you excited, what you could do all day long and never get tired of. I can see how that would make a career enjoyable. Most work involves negative feedback loops, Mr. Hall continued. Most people work out of necessity. They need food, shelter, and entertainment, which puts their life in the negative, so they seek money. As soon as they have some money, they pay the bills, all needs are met, and they're back at zero, which is good enough until more needs arise. When you work from your passions and talents, you're working with positive feedback loops. You do something you enjoy, and that moves you toward a positive balance, and you want even more. You may feel satisfied, and you may always stay happily in the black, but you never get enough. There's always more to enjoy, to do, to learn, to discover, to teach and share. It's a fantastic way to spend your life. I get it, I said, nodding my head. But does anyone really find a job like that never gets old? Well, admitted Mr. Hall, most jobs have multiple facets to them, and not all of them may match your passions and talents. You may love teaching, but dislike grading. You may love to travel and see new places and meet new people, but also crave stability. You may love acting, but also love marine biology and writing and travel and languages and dance and hiking, Annetta said, looking at Amy. You may love bread pudding, but also love Spencer, Amy shot back sarcastically. I laughed, and Netta returned what might be best described as a gentle glare, as if to say, don't encourage her. Well, I asked, do you love bread pudding? Also, Mr. Hall added, you don't have to match all your talents and passions to your job, but make sure you find some time for them, at least in your free time. Unused talents tend to demand attention by making you feel restless and unfulfilled. A light went off in my head. So talents and passions have a lot to do with leading a meaningful life, I thought out loud. Yes, Mr. Hall agreed, exactly. And they're different for everyone, I continued. Of course. And that's why there's no one single universal key to the meaning of life, I concluded. Well, Mr. Hall began, talents and passions are one key, but there must be others too. Okay, Dad, Amy sighed. We know courage will come into the conversation, so let's get it over with. Yes, Mr. Hall agreed. Once you've found your talents and passions, it takes courage to act on them. Courage to go forward without knowing everything yet. Take things day by day, moment by moment. Trust that the way will open to you. All right, Amy exclaimed. Passion and talents. Check. Courage. Check. Riding snowmobiles before all the snow melts? Nope. It looks like our work is cut out for us. She stood up and stretched, then sat down and started her machine. You guys coming? She asked as she donned her helmet. The rest of us stood up and packed our lunches back in the sleds. Once we had put on our helmets and started our engines, the four of us charged off in single file toward a new canyon. We rarely stopped to talk, but sometimes followed each other when someone found a good jump or a hill to climb. Sometimes one of our sleds would get stuck in the powder, and we would all dig and pull together to get it free. It was exhausting work, but easier than doing it alone. Sometimes we would separate, crossing over low ridges into other canyons and drainages, and not see each other for minutes at a time. I found a small clearing hemmed in with a few small aspens and tall pine trees and stopped in the middle. I hadn't seen anyone else for 10 or 15 minutes. I shut off the engine to listen for the sound of their sleds and determine which direction I should go next. What I heard took me completely by surprise. The silence of this little patch of sunlight stood out in such calm contrast to the screaming engines I had listened to all day that I almost held my breath to avoid disturbing it. The soft powder lay unbroken around me except for my single track coming in, and blue tree shadows rested unmoving, unflinching on its surface. The trees stood perfectly still and straight, and it struck me that this is all they did, day in, day out, for 50 or 100 years or more. It charmed me, and I decided to try it for just a few minutes and see how it felt. I took off my helmet and lay down along the snowmobile seat, staring up at the blue, blue sky, letting the peace work its way inside. Nature was my passion. I wanted this day to last forever. I wanted Christmas vacation to last forever. I didn't want Annetta to move away, and I didn't want to end up gone and forgotten. But there was no use thinking about that now. My family would be here in a few days. I'd introduce Netta to everyone and build as many ties as possible. I'd try to make this a lasting relationship and discover where it might go from there. That was the best I could do. For now, I would simply enjoy myself as much as possible. I would breathe deep and close my eyes to better appreciate the silence.